Okay, so I'm going to talk about the historical evolution of the presidency, and I'm going to argue as a historian answering a political science question that the best way to understand the presidency is to treat it as a historical institution. As a historical institution. We're going to talk about this more this afternoon when we do the primary documents, but you all know this already. Article 2 of the Constitution, one of the three readings, is actually one of the vaguest parts of the Constitution. Most of Article 2 is about the election of presidents, not what presidents do. And in fact, the way the founders assumed elections would work is never how they've worked. The founders assumed that the House of Representatives would more often than not choose the President of the United States because they expected that no one would get a majority of the electoral votes. Their belief was that favorite sons from large states would always have electoral votes from those states. So as happened in 1824, you all know this, the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. They expected it to work that way. It only happened that way twice. So most of what's in Article 2 does not represent the reality even of how presidents are chosen. They would not recognize our campaign system, our primary system today at all. And much of Article 2 doesn't address what presidents do. The way to understand the presidency is to understand it as a historical institution. The Constitution is just the opening round. It's the tip-off of the basketball game. And of course, it matters how the ball is tipped off. But what happens the rest of the game matters much, much more. The book I've written about this that I think you guys are going to get copies of is just about this, the evolution of the office. And my argument is that over time, the office has taken on more and more and become more impossible, in fact. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'm not here to give a book talk. I'm here to talk about the history of the office and how that matters for our understanding the presidency. I think there's 6 issues. These are not the only issues that matter, but these are the 6 topics that I think were near and dear to the hearts of the founders that become, I think, anchors or frameworks for thinking about how the office has grown over time, how it's changed over time. The presidency was created to protect the Union. One of the most important debates the founders have is what will these United States, as they were called at the time, what will they be? What I like to remind students all the time was that no one in 1789 referred to him or herself as an American. You were a citizen of Georgia. You were a citizen of Massachusetts. Sometimes you didn't even refer to yourself that way. People did not call themselves American. And this sense of unity that is so necessary to our system was not there at the start. One of the reasons to have a president was to have a figure who could be a uniting figure for the country. What the founders looked to was the experience of monarchy. They did not like hereditary power. As Thomas Paine said, they recognized that the son of the banker, or the son of the butcher, he said, the son of the butcher is no more likely to be a fool than the son of a king, and the son of the butcher is likely to be a better man, he said. Right, we're all sons of butchers in a sense here, right? Not sons of the other thing, sons of butchers. And that his argument was that, in fact, our system should not have hereditary power. And people often ask me, what is American democracy built around? It's built around the skepticism toward nepotism. The skepticism toward any professional institution, any democratic institution, doesn't empower nepotism. You don't get to make your sons and daughters your successors in the school system you're in. They have to work their way through if they want to get there. The country needed a unifying figure. They didn't want a king, they didn't want hereditary power, but there had to be someone who spoke for and brought all Americans together, who created this thing called union. We'll talk more about that with George Washington. They believed there had to be someone also who strengthened the nation, who had an interest in the larger issues and larger concerns of the nation. We would come to call this the national interest. They didn't use that phrase. That's actually a late 19th, early 20th century phrase. War making. Someone had to be commander-in-chief. One of the things Article 2 does is actually appoint or anoint the president as the commander-in-chief of American military forces. Most prime ministers don't have that role. Most prime ministers don't have that role. Presidents were supposed to help citizens. What that meant over time would grow. Administer a complex society. What that would mean over time would grow. And then leading the world, well, maybe not so much at the founding, but that's become an important part of what presidents do. When I talk to people about what a presidential system is in contrast to a parliamentary system, I say a presidential system is a system where there is an individual, an executive, who is elected and given power to do these things separate from Congress and separate from the judiciary. Not without oversight, not without restriction and limit, but given a separate responsibility. Federalist 10 lays this out very clearly. We are to be a system of checks and balances, and there is to be some power appointed to the president, given to the president in these areas. Not full power, but power to work in these areas. So here is his Independence Hall, where the work on the Constitution was done. Another point that needs to be made is that these gentlemen, these men at Independence Hall, did not know what they were doing. They were incredibly thoughtful people, but they were not setting in stone something to exist for 250 years. They were creating a system that would adjust and grow over time. Their intention, and it's clear, is not to tell later generations what to do, but to create a system that over time would allow later generations to build and adjust the democracy for their purposes. So if you are an original intentist, you are someone who is about adjustment over time. They did not see themselves as biblical scholars writing the Word of God. They saw themselves creating a political system. And as Michael Kamen wrote many years ago in one of the best books on the Constitution, he called it the genius machine. It was a genius machine because it adjusted over time. It adjusted over time. We're in one of those moments. One of the ways I think I find to get undergraduates excited about this is to say we're in one of those constitutional moments where we have lots of problems that we're going to have to work out, and working them out is actually going to make this Constitution more interesting for all of us. Right? That's the work they should be getting into. That's what the votes are going to be about. That's what our elections are about. Okay, George Washington really invents the presidency, not the Constitution. George Washington invents the presidency. No one knew what it was going to be. It's the same with all of you, right? There can be all kinds of rules and regulations of what it means to teach. But the person who invents teaching is the person in the classroom, right? It's not the rules and regulations that the AISD system gives you, whoever else, right? It's what you do in the classroom that defines what teaching is, which is why there's so much variation, right? George Washington invents the presidency. I love this Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. It's not actually what he looked like. If you want to know what he looked like, go see the Rembrandt Peale portrait in Fort Worth. You see an old man with a paunch and bad skin and all these things you'd expect. This is the image of what the presidency should be. And one of the best ways, I think, to teach history is to do art history, right? Have kids look at something and analyze it. I find my students are fantastic at working through thousands of images. They're not very good at looking at something. They're not very good at analyzing what they see. What happens about this point in the lecture is the students get very uncomfortable because they're concerned there's a mechanical difficulty right now, that the screen is not shifting and Washington is not moving. The point of Gilbert Stuart's portrait, if you can see it, the lighting's not great, we'll give it a try. What he's doing in this image is telling us what the aspirations of the presidency were, how it was being invented by Washington. Notice Washington here is dressed in nice clothes, but not regal clothes. You will not see an 18th or 19th century portrait of a king in such modest clothing. He is not bejeweled. He is not bejeweled. But he is wearing clothes that are somewhat distinct, and you should feel, even if you go see this portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, if you're looking straight on it, you should feel like you're kind of looking up a little bit, right? Everyone feels, I mean, of course now because you're sitting, right? Everyone feels that they're looking up to him a little bit, right? He's supposed to come from the people, rise from the people, but still be of the people. It's radical. No leader is that way in Europe. No one looks that way in Europe. He comes from the people. The word associated with this image in Stuart's notes is virtue. The president was to be a paragon of virtue, representing the best of the people, coming from the people, still connected to the people, but rising above them. We used to talk about presidents that way. He has all the symbols of enlightenment. He's an enlightened figure, right? The books, he's an enlightened figure. He's in the world of Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson, right? He's a man of learning. He's also a man of war, but his sword is not ready for battle. He's experienced war. He's a warrior intellectual, and he is standing. What is he doing? What's he doing? Orating, yeah. And what's the gesture? Is he telling us, is he talking down to us? What is he doing? He's open. He's open. He's bringing us together, right? It's a Roman statesman stance. If you go back and look at Roman statesman, that's where they get the word president from. He's bringing people together to go with him to the horizon that's behind him. So if you look at your Eugene Delacroix and other portraiture from the early 19th century, Napoleon is on his horse. You've all seen this. And we're looking at the back end of the horse because we're following Napoleon. The people follow the emperor. Not here. He brings people together, and we go with him. We go with him. The power of the presidency is the power to bring the country together for common problems. If Congress is to represent distinct units in the country, the president is to speak for the people. That's what sovereignty meant in the 18th century. He is to have that regal role without being a king, to speak for the people, to bring the country together. And that's how the presidency is largely invented. One of the most important early presidential documents is the farewell address. This is a depiction of the farewell address made in 1970. It's up in the Capitol Rotunda. It's a beautiful portrait. That's Hamilton. Students will now ask me why he doesn't look like Lin-Manuel Miranda. Why, they really think Hamilton is Puerto Rican now. It's great. It's amazing, right? That's their image of Alexander Hamilton. And George Washington, they know, was a white guy, right? So George Washington is there. In the farewell address, which is well worth assigning to students. We could add that to our list of primary documents here too. In the farewell address, Washington lays out what the presidency is about. Presidency is about protecting the Union, bringing the country together, and making sure that we have some functioning relationship between our different states. So we are more than the sum of our parts. The key initiatives Washington undertakes are all about this. The Hamilton Economic Plan is about building a common economy for the country. He invests in infrastructure. He talks of creating an educational system. Washington actually proposes a national university. What he does not do is tell the different parts of the country how to rule themselves. It is to bring the country together. That is the function of the president. Washington has almost no staff. He has, under the Constitution, no budget. You realize the president does not get a penny if Congress doesn't appropriate it to him. And he has no personal army of his own, right? He is the unifying figure whose power comes from the prestige of preserving the Union. And in Washington's case, his power also comes from his temporary holding of this office. He says in the farewell address that the office of the presidency is a fiduciary responsibility for the people. A fiduciary responsibility, a big word, right? Most undergraduates don't know what it means either, meaning you hold power and trust for others. You hold power and trust for others. The office goes through its first major change, I would argue. We could talk about Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, but I think the office goes through its first major change with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is the first who's not of the founding generation to be president. He's also the first who's not from Virginia or Massachusetts, right? He's the first of a different kind of president, and he doesn't wear a powdered wig. He actually is the first who doesn't wear a powdered wig. He intentionally is depicted this way, right? He is the president who brings to the office a sense that the office now has to connect with people in a new way. He is of a settler generation. He's of Scotch-Irish immigrant background, grows up in the Carolinas, moves to Tennessee as a settler in Tennessee. He's one generation removed, really, from Stephen F. Austin, right? Settlement of Texas is just the next step from where Andrew Jackson is. And Stephen F. Austin, in many ways, saw himself as a Jacksonian. Andrew Jackson takes the office that is a detached office designed to bring unity to the country, and now says the office is going to connect to the people, particularly to white settlers, as it had not before. And one of the biggest initiatives he undertakes that you all talk about in your history courses, I hope, is removal of Indians. It's the first major expansion of presidential power. We could talk about diplomacy, we could talk about the Jay Treaty, but really the first major expansion of presidential power is the removal of Indians. There's no presidential authority for that. There's nowhere in the Constitution does it say the president has any role in this. Andrew Jackson's view, is that the presidency must be about providing land access for white settlers. for white settlers. Not just purchasing land as Jefferson did, but now expanding into this area. And he will go so far, as you all know, right, in Worcester versus Georgia, to actually argue that the Supreme Court cannot stop him from doing this. That the Supreme Court cannot stop him from doing this. He will take on and expand the presidency into having the role of managing the population on federally held lands. That, by the way, interestingly enough, is the basis for Theodore Roosevelt later to declare national parks in our country, right? It is the management and control of these federal lands. And so, again, everyone knows the story, right? The Indians from Florida, the Seminole, the Cherokee, and others, tens of thousands of them are moved into Oklahoma, moved under presidential authority with the use of some congressional resources, but predominantly with the use of the American military. And the story of the presidents as commander-in-chief in the mid-19th century is using military power to remove Indians. The military history of the United States is the history of Indian removal in the mid-19th century before we get to the Civil War. The Mexican-American War is actually the side story to the reality of this. So presidential war making, this is important for our students to know. Presidential war making comes from Indian removal. Why is this really important? Because if you want to understand a lot of the things that are done in the case of the Iraq War, many of the provisions that are made for the use for placing non-combatants in certain places, it goes back to the legislation that's created by presidential authority here. We can talk more about this. That's the world that Abraham Lincoln inherits. The most fundamental transformation of the presidency from the founding generation is by Abraham Lincoln. Because Lincoln inherits, again, you all know this, he inherits not one united nation, he inherits a nation that is truly coming apart. Truly coming apart. The way to think about the United States on the eve of the Civil War is you've actually got three nations that the president is trying somehow to keep together, right? The North, right, is built around industrial capitalism at this point. Doesn't mean slavery doesn't matter. Many Northerners are getting rich from slavery, but the currency of the realm is capital investment in factory production. That's the kernel of the realm there, right? So it is a capital surplus economy. The South is what? It is a labor surplus economy, right? The wealth that Southerners have is the slaves that they own. The slaves that they own. Unless you think the United States never has socialism, right? The largest reappropriation of wealth that occurs anywhere in the world in the 19th century is the emancipation of slaves. People will say, the United States, we never take away people's private property. Well, what was the end of slavery? What was the end of slavery? It was just that, right? And the third system you have is the world that we're kind of in. Texas is like in between all three of these, right? It's the world of land surplus, right? Too few people on the land, right? Why have Texans, even to this day, always supported immigration? Look at the surveys on this, right? Because we don't have enough people. Maybe in Austin we have enough people now, but we don't have enough people. We have too much land and too few people on the land. We need talent. In Austin we need talent. We don't have enough computer programmers, right? We need people coming in with talent, right? So you have three different economic systems. Lincoln has to use the presidency not just to expand in the land. He's for expansion like Jackson. He's for unity like Washington. He has to invent a new way to knit these three areas together. He has to conduct a new kind of war. And I just put this image up, not to be gory, but to remind people that the Civil War was not toy soldiers, right? This is the bloodiest day in American history to this day. In September of 1862, more Americans died in one day in Antietam than have died in any day in our history since then. And there was not a single automatic weapon. There was not a single bomb dropped. This was all with breech rifle loaders and hand-to-hand combat. 30,000 Americans died in this one day, killed hand to hand. And these images that were taken by Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady transformed people. People had never seen this before. They had never seen this before. Lincoln was seen by Europeans, including liberals in Europe, as a butcher. He was undertaking killing on a scale that never existed before. It fundamentally changed the presidency. It gave the president not simply war-making power, it gave the president control over people's lives that presidents never had before. Before 1863, Lincoln was able to get soldiers for the Union Army by going to state governors and asking them to give volunteers. That's where the first Union soldiers come from, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, elsewhere, right? What happens with the Conscription Acts of 1862, 1863? The president takes on, this is nowhere in the Constitution, the ability to requisition human bodies. Conscription, the creation of a conscript army. Right now, we have an all-volunteer army today, but the president has the powers of conscription. Historians will say that this is the moment, the first moment that the president actually gets control over bodies. If Jackson is taking control over land and moving non-American bodies, as they're seen, Indians, right? Now Lincoln is making life and death choices with people's bodies. And that's how he wins the Civil War. He uses more bodies in the North to kill more bodies in the South. His problem with McClellan is McClellan won't actually do enough of the killing. So he finally finds Grant, who will do enough of the killing for him. Lincoln says this in his second inaugural. We're going to talk the Gettysburg Address later, but his second inaugural, which along with the Gettysburg Address is, here you have a man with 2 years of education who has 2 of the 5 most important speeches in our history, a man who is a greater literary stylist than any other politician in our history, up there with Mark Twain as a literary stylist. What does he say in the second inaugural address? He says, we have fought this war, right, so that every drop of blood drawn with the lash will be paid by another drawn with the sword. We're going to take this cancer out of our system, right? This is open heart surgery. We're taking this out of our system, and we're creating a new nation with the president at the head of that new nation, right? What else does Lincoln do? He forces through Congress, because the Democrats are not in Congress, the Homestead Act that gives land to immigrants from Mexico, Italy, Germany, and elsewhere, land that they couldn't have access to before. You can become a landowner then before you're a citizen. I always remind people of that. The American bargain in the 19th century was you come, you work the land, you keep the land. You don't even have to be a citizen. Second, public universities, right? The Morrill Land Grant Act. That's where there's that place in College Station. I can't remember their name, right? They're the land grant university, right? The creation, University of Wisconsin, Michigan State, University of California, Berkeley. Cornell is partially a land grant university. MIT is partially land grant, right? Creating public universities for the people. And then the Transcontinental Railroad Act, creating a modern railway infrastructure system. Lincoln had been the lawyer for the railroad, so this made a lot of sense to him. And the Transcontinental Railroad, what does it do by 1869? It creates an integrated industrial market in the United States, which is all you need to know about the growth of American power to this day. We become the single largest integrated market in the world. We still are. That allows talent to move to Austin from any part of this vast continent, right? Austin can recruit that talent. We can use that talent. We can bring John Buchleiter from North Carolina here, right? We can bring that talent in. We can make things from that talent, and we can send it out. It's the source of our wealth. It is the Republican Party dream. That's what Lincoln is all about. Poor white boys like Lincoln having access to a growing economy with resources they could never dream of before. Slavery is the opposite of that. That is presidential reconstruction of the country. And the tragedy of Andrew Johnson, as you all know the story, is that he stands in the way of this for a long time. And this dream is never fully fulfilled. Whether Lincoln would have been able to do it or not, we don't know. But that's what's happening here. That is a fundamental growth and phase change for the presidency. If Washington is an 18th century wise man and Jackson is a frontier settler president, Lincoln is a capitalist president. He's a CEO president. He's a capitalist president. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt inherits this world. We could talk about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, if we were doing foreign policy, I'd spend more time on that. Theodore Roosevelt really takes these ideas and establishes the president as a more powerful foreign policy actor, creating a world-class Navy, getting involved in international diplomacy, and very explicitly putting teeth behind the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt corollary of 1904 that you all know, really giving the United States a right of intervention. So we could talk about that, but it's not a foreign policy discussion here, right? Most fundamentally for the presidency, if Lincoln is the biggest transformation, the second biggest transformation from Washington is under Franklin Roosevelt. And it's because of this problem, right? It's because of the fundamental crash of the American economy and the global capitalist system in the early 20th century. Why does this happen? Why does this happen? It happens, in fact, because this worked too well. Because the solution to this, the use of war power, worked too well. The American system was actually producing too much, right? The insight from Amartya Sen that I think everyone needs to know is that famines don't occur when there's too little food, they occur when there's too much food. Because there's no incentive to move the food, right? You don't get paid to move it if there's too much of it, right? So, the United States is overproducing. When the United States overproduces, farmers borrow more money, right? They're like Uber drivers today. If you're getting paid less for each trip and you need to make $50, you take more people on more trips. And what's the irony of this, right? My undergraduates have realized this when they try to drive for Uber. You get paid less each time. The more you're out there driving, the less you get paid. So you have to do more and more trips to get that $50 that you need or whatever it is. It's the same problem with the American economy. It's making more and more food. Farmers can't get enough revenue from the food they're growing. So what do? They borrow money to grow more food. And they keep borrowing. They go into more and more debt, which creates the crash of 1929, which is that very technical moment that occurs in every bubble. It's the holy shit moment when people realize, wait a second, people are not going to be able to pay back. The land is no longer worth the debt on the land. The house is no longer worth the debt on the house. And all of a sudden, then the economy goes into a tailspin. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't know what to do. He's not an economist. He doesn't know what to do. What he does know that he can do is use the presidency to recharge parts of the economy. Franklin Roosevelt tells his staff, I'm about one thing, my presidency is going to be about one thing and one thing alone, jobs. Making jobs for people. He turns the presidency not simply into a war-making body and a land-holding body, but now into a job-creating office. A job-creating office. I love this cartoon. It tells you how things have not changed. Look at Congress in this cartoon. That could be Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi as much as it could be anyone at that time. It could be either side of the aisle today as it is either side of the aisle then, right? Congress doesn't know what to do. Uncle Sam is sick. The president is the medicine man carrying his medicine bag. This is lost on undergraduates today. They have no idea what a house call would ever be. They want to know why he's not asking for their insurance card. But the president is coming to their home, and he is bringing an elixir or a set of elixirs to try to revive Uncle Sam. And I need to say, because people often ask me, the NRA is not the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration. These elixirs are presidentially sponsored efforts to put people to work. If Lincoln puts bodies in the army, as no president could before, Roosevelt puts bodies to work. Roosevelt puts bodies to work. You see this all around us. This is a great thing to teach students because they can see it everywhere. The UT Tower was a Works Project Administration project. I've led groups of legislators through there. Almost none of them know that. They actually will often say to me, it's not true. We would never accept federal money for this. There is a plaque that says it. I mean, I walk them over to the plaque. It says it on the plaque. My kids went to Briker Woods Elementary School here in town. Briker Woods has a big plaque, WPA project. If you've been to Big Bend National Park, all the pathways, CCC projects. This is the presidency now expanding into local communities, providing local communities with work opportunities. Ronald Reagan's father was employed through the WPA and various other entities. That's this experience that takes us into World War II. What makes World War II so transformative is the New Deal has now made an international project. What does the president do? What does Roosevelt do? He says that the problems of fascism are problems of economic deprivation in other societies, and I, as president, am going to get involved in sponsoring economic development programs in other societies. And that's not just foreign aid. We get this wrong. That's not charity, right? That's actually building a world system of connected economies, which makes the president a world leader as he hadn't been before, symbolized by these war conferences. This was unthinkable for Washington, that the president of the United States would be sitting there between the leader of the communist world and the leader of the British Empire, negotiating the future of the world system and making them do it on his terms. At Tehran, he forces them to agree to this thing called the United Nations, a United Nations that's going to allow every country to be represented, but is also going to have what Roosevelt calls 4 policemen. The United States, Britain, Soviet Union, and China. And China at this time is completely dependent on the United States. So as Churchill says, Roosevelt's getting 2 votes for himself, right? As in a good politician, wants more votes. And we create a world system You all grew up with this in the Cold War. Our students didn't. Where the United States is an assumed world leader. And the president, no one said this in 1935. The president is the leader of the, quote, free world. Right? The president now takes on responsibility. And what does that mean? It means he can use our bodies and our resources overseas with very little consent from us. Sure, we can vote him out of office, but very little consent from us. Most citizens were not asked if we should have a large nuclear arsenal. Most citizens were not asked whether we should be in Vietnam. Right? Whether you're for or against it, I'm not arguing these are good or bad decisions. I'm just saying the president is now taking on this enormous global responsibility. And that creates amazing administrative responsibility. This building next to the White House until the end of World War II, along with the Treasury Department on the other side, was the entire federal government. Now it is just the president's staff. In fact, the president's staff doesn't even fit in there. Right? This building, constructed during World War II, the Pentagon, overseen by Leslie Groves, the same man who oversees the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project. It is the largest office building in the world until the early 21st century. The United Department of Defense, the Constitution has a separate small army and a small navy, war and navy. They're put together in a large Department of Defense with a large standing military. There's no authority for that in the Constitution. This is created with the National Security Act of 1947. The Pentagon becomes the largest employer in the world. Today, there are two entities that employ more than the Pentagon: the Chinese military and Walmart. Right? I love when people say I'm anti-government and I'm strong military. What are you talking about? That's government. That's government. That's the president oversees that, right? Congress and the president oversee. The president has direct day-to-day oversight over the largest body, the most employees after the Chinese military in the world work for the president. Washington had none. Roosevelt had a personal staff of 4. Now the president has all of this and all of this. And here's the interesting thing. Even when you get a president who says they're about cutting government, it doesn't get that much smaller because the work of administration, it's like a school system. You give a superintendent who says, oh, I'm for a smaller system, it's going to look the same. They're just going to do less with the same number of people. I just wanted to show this. I'll spend just a couple more minutes. I just wanted to show what this means in practice about presidents, just in our own lifetimes, and show like what we do as historians. I love being a historian because we get to work with the original materials, the primary materials you're presenting to your students. So here are calendars. These are in the book you're going to get a copy of too. Roosevelt on the day after Pearl Harbor, that's his calendar. Missy LeHand, his secretary, just writes things in. He's got a lot of time. He's not fooling around. He's using this time to actually think about what to say when he goes to Congress and to lead. The American public is deeply isolationist on December 8th, 1941, doesn't know what to do. They're looking for leadership. He's able to lead. He's able to take the time to do that. This is John F. Kennedy just 20 years later. Look at what happens in 20 years. Think of it this way. There are now more than 100 countries in the world that we're worried about communist expansion into. There are now all these new agencies that Roosevelt created that the president has to oversee. It's because of this and this that the president's calendar looks like this, right? Same reason your calendars get busy, because you're not just teaching, right? Now you got to coach, right? And you got to go to this committee meeting and this training and that training. You sometimes wonder if you have any time left to teach, right? When are you supposed to grade papers? You have no time left, right? Look at Lyndon Johnson. This is one of 8 pages. This is the same day as the Selma March and the first deployment of American Marines to Da Nang in Vietnam. Same day. He's on the phone. He forgets who he's talking to half the time. There's a phone conversation, you can go listen to it, where he's got Martin Luther King and George Wallace, 2 different receivers, and he gets them mixed up. And Dr. King says, Mr. President, I don't think that was meant for me. He gets them mixed up. Even Ronald Reagan. This is one of 3 days in a row. The guy's on vacation in Augusta, waking up at 2 a.m. This is the beginnings of the war on terror. This is the bombing of the American embassy in Beirut. Some of you might remember. This is one of my first memories as a kid. It interrupted the football game I was watching, right? The American Marine barracks bombed and more than 200 Americans dying from this group we hadn't heard of called Hezbollah, with this thing we hadn't seen called the suicide bomb in 1983. That's what brings us to the current world. If we want to understand the debates about the president today, there are these debates. There are debates about how far should presidential power go. This is an ongoing debate. Have we gone too far? Did we, after 9/11, invest too much in the power of this office? Have we created an office that's not only too large, but also too cut off from us? I put this up to talk about the plane, not the man in the plane here. Air Force One is the representation of the president now, right? And it's the power of the president, but also the limitations of that power, the problems with that power. It's an amazing machine. It levitates the White House. Wherever the president goes, the White House goes with him. He never gets away. Imagine if your students went with you everywhere you went, right? If you've ever made the mistake of taking an overseas field trip with students or alumni, I learned not to do that after doing it once, right? They don't go away. You have every problem. The White House goes with him. He never gets away. But here's the really interesting thing. He never lives like us. That power now has taken the office exactly where the founders didn't want it to go. He's not a king, but he's cut off from the people in the way a king would be. I'll give you an example of this. President Obama went to India 2 times, actually, as president. My family's from India. My father's an immigrant from India. I have a lot of family in India. Deeply appreciative that the president spent so much time there. And he was sincere about it. It was wonderful. As you know, from Indians, very talkative, very strong opinions. So I was getting a lot from my family when he was in India. Lots and lots of family there, more family than I can count, right? So I would get daily updates, I'm getting comments on everything, right? I'm getting all of this. And what I realized, I spent a lot of time in India. What I realized was he wasn't in India. He wasn't in India. He was there. It was not the India I go to or you go to. He wasn't stopping in traffic. There were not beggars coming up to him. Right? It wasn't dirty and grimy way. He was in a different world. He was in a different world. Have you sat next to a CEO recently when you flied on Southwest? Right? President Obama came here in 2004. He pinched my son's cheek. Zachary didn't want to wash his face for like a whole week. Flew in, Air Force One, got in the 3 limos. They closed this entire half of campus. The only day I've ever seen that happen. They pull the limos up to the LBJ library. He goes in, gave a wonderful speech, got back in the limos, went back on the plane. Was he in Austin? I'm told he stopped for Torchy's Tacos also. Was he in Austin? Did he experience anything? Did he learn anything? One of the challenges is that what this world is revealing to us is that there is a legitimate, honest sense many Americans have, who we agree with or disagree, that these offices are cut off from them, and that the presidency has moved beyond what was intended, not because of conspiracy, but because of the historical evolution of the office. Why should our students study the presidency? Why should they care about it? Not because it's some stale, old institution, not because of what the Constitution says, but because over time these institutions have changed, as they should. We have to understand that change so we can change it to make it fit our world today. We want our students to understand how we've come to this moment, and we want them to understand how coming to this moment opens possibilities to do things differently. The problem is not the Constitution. The problem is how the office has evolved over time, for good and for ill, and how we can think about alternative ways for it to evolve. What we try to do on the podcast is talk about different kinds of leadership. What will leadership look like tomorrow? Lincoln reinvented the office. Roosevelt reinvented the office. How are we going to reinvent the office in the future? The presidency was created, just where I started, not written in stone, not intended to be an institution that would operate the same way for all generations. That's the strength of our system. Our obligation is to understand that and to take upon us the historically informed effort to reform our institutions. And our students are supposed to be the ones doing that. In fact, some of the best assignments I find for my students is getting them to use history to try to imagine something different. Don't just tell us how it happened. Tell us how knowing how it happened gives us a chance to think about how it can happen differently in the future. We study the past to imagine a new future. There's no better place to do that than with the presidency. Thank you.